Dawn crept slowly over the Nevada high desert, its pale orange glow brushing the distant mountain ridges as the last shreds of the violent autumn storm faded into memory. Wind-blown tumbleweeds dotted the hardpan earth, and the scent of wet sage hung in the cold, crystalline air. Branches and debris littered the ground around Samuel Parker's weathered homestead, a stark, isolated ranch that seemed, after so many years, almost an extension of the man himself. At 70, Samuel moved slowly, each step measured and deliberate, the weight of memory and loss etched into the lines of his face and the stiffness in his joints. The storm had been a savage one, rattling the windows and battering the tin roof with sheets of rain and gusts fierce enough to topple fence posts. Samuel, alone now for nearly a decade since his beloved June had passed, had lain awake through most of the night, listening to the fury and thinking of all that needed fixing come morning. As the first hints of sunlight pierced the low clouds, he shrugged into a battered canvas coat and slipped his feet into muddy boots, bracing himself for the chores ahead. There would be gates to mend, stock to check, and, most urgent of all, the southern fence line. His old enemy, always the first casualty of a hard blow. Samuel's walk was interrupted not by the expected damage, but by something far stranger, a shivering stillness, a kind of hush that seemed unnatural even after a storm. As he crested the shallow rise near the dry creek bed, he saw it, a wild Mustang, chestnut and powerful even in distress, sprawled in the dirt like a fallen monarch. The horse's black mane tangled wildly over its neck, streaked with burrs and flecked with dried blood. Barbed wire coiled around its right hind leg, biting deep into flesh already slick with mud and pain. For a long moment, Samuel simply stared, heart thumping, memories flickering in his mind. June had loved horses. All creatures, really, but she'd had a particular reverence for the Mustangs. "They're spirits of this land, Sam," she used to say, brushing her gentle hands through the air as if conjuring their shapes. "Don't ever forget. We share this place with them." Samuel had never shared her poetic streak, but he'd felt it, especially now, confronted with the living symbol of freedom brought low by man's careless wire. Instinct told him to walk away. This was nature's business, not his. A wild animal so badly injured would likely not survive, and the risk of getting close, those powerful hooves could kill a man in a heartbeat. But another voice, softer yet stubborn, rose up inside him. June's voice. Compassion, she'd insisted, was the only thing that set people apart from the world's hardness. Samuel's hands shook slightly as he approached, speaking low and steady as he neared the animal, each word a kind of prayer. He circled wide, avoiding the stallion's head, and knelt by the wounded leg. The horse's gold-flecked eyes flashed with terror and rage, but it was too exhausted to lash out. Samuel reached for the wire, careful to keep his movements deliberate. Each twist of metal was slow, his breath visible in the morning chill. Blood welled as he pried the last barb free, the horse groaning and struggling, but Samuel did not flinch. At last the leg was liberated, the wound ugly but open to the air. There was no halter, no rope. Just Samuel, his battered coat, and the wild Mustang, both of them alone beneath the pale desert sky. He backed away, letting the animal rest, his own knees throbbing from the strain. For a few minutes, nothing happened. Then, with a groan, the horse struggled to rise, but the injured leg buckled and it collapsed again, a tremor of panic rippling through its frame. Samuel felt the old ache in his heart, a familiar companion but sharper now. Here was life, wounded and vulnerable, and he the only witness. The sun rose higher, gilding the sage and casting long blue shadows across the sand. Samuel stood guard, silent and watchful, fighting an urge to run for help and another, deeper urge to simply let nature run its course. He thought of June again, her laughter, the way she'd once risked her life to save a stray calf from a flash flood. He remembered her stubbornness, her refusal to give up on anything or anyone. That memory decided him. Samuel trudged back to the house and dialed his neighbor, Tom Buckley, his voice gruff with fatigue. Tom listened, then told him flatly to call animal control. "It's the right thing, Sam. Those injuries, they won't heal. Better to end it clean." Samuel thanked him and hung up, heart sinking. But something in him rebelled at the idea of giving up so quickly, and instead he reached for the number of Dr. Marcus Bell, the town vet and a friend since childhood. Marcus was blunt. "Sam, you know wild Mustangs rarely survive this kind of damage. And a cornered stallion, he'll kill you if you're not careful. Let the professionals handle it." Samuel listened, nodding, but even as Marcus spoke, he was already imagining a different future. A last great effort, one act of stubborn hope before letting go of the ranch, of everything. He made his decision as the first sunbeams dried the blood on his hands. He would try to save the horse, and in doing so, maybe save a part of himself. The morning air was still cold as Samuel lingered on the porch. The memory of the Mustang's wide, pained eyes etched deep into his thoughts. A kettle whistled quietly on the stove behind him, but he barely noticed. He felt the weight of his decision settle over him like a heavy coat, an odd mix of dread and resolve. Throughout his years on this remote ranch, Samuel had witnessed the merciless logic of nature. He knew that mercy was often the more difficult path. His hands still trembled from the effort of freeing the horse from the wire, and a dull ache had crept into his shoulders. Yet even as doubt gnawed at him, something unyielding took root. A kind of promise made to his late wife, and perhaps to himself. He paced across the porch, boots creaking against the old wood, replaying his conversation with Tom Buckley in his mind. Tom was a practical man, never one to romanticize animals or waste time on lost causes. Samuel respected him, but this time, he felt the boundaries of friendship and practicality chafe against the call of something more instinctive, a need to act, to intervene. The alternative, calling animal control, meant resigning the Mustang to a swift, merciful death. It would be easy, efficient, and above all, final. Yet Samuel could not bring himself to do it. Instead, he dialed Dr. Marcus Bell, listening as the familiar voice on the other end delivered the hard truth. Marcus's warnings were rational, rooted in experience and professional caution, but they struck Samuel as another barrier to overcome. The risks were real, no doubt. The possibility of being injured by a terrified, wounded stallion, the chance that all his effort might end in failure and disappointment. But Samuel's stubbornness had always been both his vice and his virtue. After he hung up, he found himself standing at the kitchen window, staring out at the battered landscape, the distant form of the horse still barely visible near the creek bed. He filled a battered thermos with coffee, packed a faded blanket, and rummaged through a cabinet for whatever medical supplies he had on hand. An old tin of antiseptic, a pair of scissors, a handful of cotton pads, a roll of bandages left over from some long-ago injury. He wasn't a vet, but decades of ranch life had taught him the basics of tending wounds. He tossed the supplies into a canvas sack, grabbed a handful of sugar cubes — June had always sworn by them for skittish animals — and set out across the yard, the ground still soft and slick beneath his boots. The Mustang had not moved far. Its breaths came fast and shallow, nostrils flaring as Samuel approached, but exhaustion kept it from bolting. Samuel crouched a few feet away, speaking softly, letting his presence settle over the anxious animal like a blanket. The Mustang's flanks heaved, muscles tensing at every sound, but it did not lash out. Samuel unwrapped the bandages, his movements careful and deliberate. He dabbed at the worst of the blood and mud, flinching at the sight of exposed flesh and swelling, but refusing to turn away. Each touch was met with suspicion, a wild glint in the horse's eyes, but the animal seemed to sense his intent, tolerating the rough treatment in wary silence. Hours slipped by, measured in the slow work of cleaning wounds and whispering old ranch stories. Samuel's breath fogged in the cold air as he pressed a sugar cube into the dirt near the Mustang's nose, watching the horse eye it with suspicion before finally, haltingly, taking the treat. There was no miracle recovery, only the gradual lessening of tension, the slow realization that, for now, neither meant the other harm. As the sun rose higher, Samuel found himself settling into a rhythm. Clean, comfort, retreat, return. Again and again, he battled the urge to give up, to walk away and leave nature to its mercies. But each time, the memory of June's gentle persistence spurred him on. That afternoon, Tom Buckley drove up in his battered pickup, his face drawn with concern and frustration. He stood at the fence line, watching Samuel tend to the Mustang, and shook his head. "You're wasting your strength, Sam," he called out, voice low and heavy. Samuel acknowledged him with a nod, but didn't pause his work. There was nothing more to say. Tom left after a while, leaving only tire tracks in the soft earth and a sense of quiet isolation. Later, clouds gathered again on the horizon, and a chill wind swept over the desert. Samuel pulled the blanket tighter around the Mustang, his own hands numb from the cold. He built a crude windbreak from broken branches and whatever scrap he could find, determined to shield the horse from the worst of the weather. As night crept in, he crouched beside the animal, the blanket his only barrier against the freezing air. He recited stories and memories, not for the horse, but for himself, filling the silence with words that eased the loneliness and made the night a little less unforgiving. Each day that followed brought new tests. The Mustang's wounds showed signs of infection, and Samuel fought to keep the animal calm as he cleaned and dressed the injuries. He found himself talking aloud, sometimes to the horse, sometimes to June, sometimes to the wide, empty desert, about the stubbornness it took to survive, about old regrets and lost dreams, about hope that lingered even when logic failed. Through it all, the Mustang endured, never fully trusting, but never giving up either. By the week's end, Samuel knew there would be no turning back. Saving the Mustang was no longer just an act of compassion. It had become a lifeline for them both, a final defiance against the passage of time and the creeping shadow of loneliness. In the Mustang's struggle, Samuel found a reflection of his own, battered, scarred, but unwilling to surrender. And so, despite the doubts of neighbors and the warnings of friends, Samuel pressed on, driven by memory, by hope, and by a quiet, stubborn promise not to let go. Cold had a way of crawling into Samuel's bones, finding every old injury, every crack in his armor, and reminding him he was no longer young. Nights on the ranch were always sharp this time of year, but with the recent storm's devastation, the chill felt deeper, almost predatory. The Mustang's makeshift shelter stood as a lonely outpost on the edge of his property, Framed by a tangle of wind-snapped branches and hunks of battered plywood, Samuel had scavenged from his tool shed. It wasn't much, but it was all he could offer in the face of winter's early arrival. Each day began before sunrise, when frost coated the world in a brittle silver skin. Samuel would trudge out across the frozen grass, breath steaming, feeling the ache in his knees and the roughness in his hands. The Mustang, battered but still defiant, watched every approach with wary eyes. Its breathing remained labored, and infection lingered in the wound, a dark bruise beneath the raw red flesh. More than once, Samuel questioned the sense in what he was doing. The smart thing would have been to accept the odds and let go, but reason had never kept a rancher going when hope was all that remained. Inside the small shelter, the world was reduced to the slow rhythms of care. Samuel cleaned the wound with warm water, poured from a battered thermos he'd heated on the stove, and dabbed at the swelling with a soft cloth. The Mustang responded with flinches, snorts, and sometimes a half-hearted attempt to kick, but its energy was spent more on survival than resistance. The only thing Samuel feared more than the pain in his own back was the moment the horse would give up and lie still for good. Food and water became their common ground. Samuel would scoop oats and scatter them beside the makeshift shelter, always careful to stay just out of striking range. Some days the Mustang ignored him, too weak to care, but on others, it would stretch its neck and eat in slow, careful motions. He spoke little, just an occasional, gentle murmur, letting his presence be reassurance rather than intrusion. At night, when the wind screamed through the hills and darkness pressed against the world, Samuel found himself lingering beside the shelter, telling stories he'd once told June, stories she'd loved. Tales of wild horses, stubborn mules, and the dry, reckless humor that ranch life required. The ranch seemed to hold its breath in those hours, as if nature itself was waiting to see whether compassion would win out over circumstance. Samuel's nights grew longer and colder. Often he would fall asleep on the ground beside the shelter, wrapped in his own threadbare blanket. The chill cutting through his coat, but refusing to leave the horse alone in its pain. Sometimes, as he lay awake, he would hear coyotes crying in the distance, or the restless shuffle of the Mustang, and he'd wonder if the animal understood the gamble they were taking together. One night, a hard frost swept down from the mountains, turning the sky to crystal and dusting the world in white. Samuel woke shivering, his teeth chattering, every joint stiff and angry with cold. The Mustang, too, was shaking uncontrollably, its breathing ragged and shallow. Samuel struggled to his feet, staggered by the realization that his own stubbornness might kill him before the winter truly set in. But then he remembered June's words. "You can't save the world, Sam, but you can do right by the piece of it you hold." Clutching his old jacket tight around him, he pressed closer to the animal, offering what little warmth he could. As dawn crawled over the hills, Samuel found himself recounting the story of the Mustang's rescue aloud. The words almost a mantra. The storm, the fence, the decision to stay. It made the cold more bearable, transformed the misery into something shared. The Mustang's eyes, once wild and rolling, grew a shade calmer. Samuel thought he saw a flicker of recognition, a truce, if not trust. Days blurred together in a routine of hardship. Each morning, Samuel checked the bandages, coaxed the Mustang to eat, cleaned away the infection as best he could, and spoke softly when the silence became too much to bear. Every small sign of improvement, a steadier step, a brighter look, lifted his spirits. But setbacks came too. Some mornings the wound looked worse, or the horse's strength seemed to ebb away. Each failure was a personal blow, a reminder that sometimes effort wasn't enough. Despite the setbacks, Samuel persisted, fueled by something more than duty, a stubborn hope that, given a chance, both he and the Mustang might outlast their trials. The bond between them, fragile as winter light, began to take shape not in dramatic moments, but in quiet perseverance, a shared refusal to surrender. As the first snows settled over the high desert, Samuel realized he'd crossed a threshold. The Mustang's survival was no longer just a project or an obligation. It had become the center of his days, a purpose that called him out into the cold and kept his heart from turning to stone. And in the darkness, beneath the indifferent stars, Samuel clung to that purpose as fiercely as the wild horse clung to life. Days crawled by in a rhythm shaped by pain and hope, the fragile thread of survival binding Samuel and the Mustang through the deepening Nevada cold. The wound on the stallion's leg remained angry and swollen, hot to the touch, the specter of infection hanging over every moment. Samuel fought against it as best he could, cleaning, dressing, and whispering words of comfort that vanished into the biting wind. At times, exhaustion and despair threatened to undo him, but each morning, he forced himself out of bed and into the bitter dawn, determined to see the struggle through. He began calling the horse Thunder, after the way its presence seemed to charge the very air around the homestead. Samuel never spoke the name aloud to the animal. He understood the fine line between respect and wishful thinking with wild creatures. But in his mind, Thunder became more than just a patient. The stallion was a living testament to stubbornness and spirit, and Samuel saw something of himself reflected in those gold-flecked eyes, a refusal to yield, even when the odds demanded surrender. As the days shortened and the nights grew sharper, Thunder's strength ebbed. The infection in his leg took hold, sapping his will and leaving him listless and hollow-eyed. Samuel watched, powerless as the wildness dulled, replaced by feverish trembling and shallow breaths. More than once, he wondered if mercy might be kinder than hope. The fear of losing Thunder gnawed at him, twisting old memories of June's quiet faith in second chances into a new kind of ache. One evening, as the sky bruised purple and gray over the horizon, Samuel recognized a grim truth. Thunder would not survive another night of cold and pain without a miracle. Driven by desperation, he shrugged off his own heavy jacket, thick, lined with faded flannel, his last real defense against the night, and laid it over the stallion's shivering body. The gesture felt both foolish and sacred, a small surrender to the need for connection that had haunted Samuel ever since he'd lost his wife. He settled in beside Thunder, pressed close for warmth, his own body aching with every shiver. The air was sharp enough to sting his lungs, and the ground beneath him was mercilessly hard. But Samuel stayed, mumbling half-remembered stories and memories into the star-drenched silence. He spoke not just to the horse, but to June, to the empty house behind him, to all the losses he carried in his heart. Each word became an offering, a plea to whatever power might be listening. The night dragged on, the cold growing deeper, relentless. Samuel drifted in and out of uneasy sleep, haunted by dreams of running hooves and open plains, of wild freedom slipping just out of reach. At some point, he awoke to find Thunder's breathing steadier, the fever receding as the horse pressed its nose into the folds of the jacket. Hope, small and flickering, stirred in Samuel's chest. As dawn broke, the world was wrapped in mist, pale light filtering through the frost-laced air. Samuel, stiff and sore, sat up slowly. Feeling every year in his bones, he reached out, intending to check the bandage on Thunder's leg. But before he could touch the horse, Thunder rose shakily to his feet, standing taller than he had in days. The stallion's sides heaved, but his eyes were clear, alert, watching Samuel with a new kind of awareness. In that moment, something shifted. Thunder stepped forward, nostrils flaring, and gently nudged Samuel's outstretched hand. It was a small gesture, barely more than a brush of warm breath and damp whiskers, but it cut through weeks of fear and suspicion like sunlight through clouds. The Mustang did not bolt or bare its teeth. Instead, it lingered, regarding Samuel with a cautious, almost curious gaze. For Samuel, the significance of the moment ran deeper than words. The wild horse, battered and freeborn, had chosen, however tentatively, to trust him. All the hardship, the nights spent shivering, the risk and ridicule from neighbors and friends, suddenly seemed worth it. In that fragile bond, Samuel found a glimmer of meaning that had been missing from his life since June's passing. It was not a promise of healing or survival, only a mutual recognition that both man and horse were not yet ready to give up. He remained beside Thunder as the sun climbed higher, sharing the quiet, broken only by the distant calls of birds and the soft crunch of frost beneath their feet. Samuel knew the struggle was not over. The wound still festered, and the winter ahead would be long and merciless. But the tide had shifted. Where once there had been only fear and pain, there now flickered the fragile beginnings of partnership, a shared stubbornness that might, just might, see them through. That day, for the first time in weeks, Samuel allowed himself to hope, not just for Thunder's survival, but for his own. The weeks that followed brought subtle changes, both at the homestead and beyond. Thunder, though far from tame, no longer flinched at Samuel's approach. The Mustang remained cautious, still wary when anyone new came near, but the worst of his infection passed, leaving him limping yet determined. The wound slowly closed, raw skin knitting together, each small victory celebrated in silence by Samuel as he watched the stallion limp along the frost-bitten ground at the edge of his land. Thunder never let himself be corralled, always slipping away before Samuel could come too close, but he lingered near the property. Sometimes he'd vanish into the sagebrush, only to reappear in the dawn light, silhouetted against the horizon like some ancient spirit of the desert. There were days when Samuel would catch him watching from a distance, his mane wild in the wind, his gold-flecked eyes thoughtful, almost human in their wariness and longing. Other mornings, Samuel would find evidence of Thunder's nighttime visits, hoof prints near the water trough, traces of oats disturbed, the scent of horse thick on the cold air. As word of the Mustang's survival drifted into town, the story began to grow beyond Samuel's control. It started with the newspaper. A curious young reporter had heard about the wild horse rescued from barbed wire and nursed through a brutal storm. She drove out to the ranch, notebook in hand, eager for the kind of human interest story that broke up the monotony of small-town news. Samuel, never one for attention, offered only the facts, his voice low and guarded, but the reporter filled in the blanks with her own sense of wonder and drama. The article, Widower's Last Stand, The Wild Mustang of Willow Creek, was published with a photograph of Thunder in the snow, head high and untamed, and soon enough, the quiet of the ranch was interrupted by a trickle of visitors. Some were neighbors, familiar faces who brought thermoses of coffee and stood along the fence line, watching Thunder with a mixture of admiration and skepticism. Old ranchers voiced their worries. Wild horses could bring disease, eat up precious grazing, attract the attention of authorities who cared little for a struggling rancher's right to privacy. "What if that stallion attracts a herd?" one man muttered, boots grinding into the frost. "You'll have the state all over your back, Sam." But there were others too, children with wide eyes, city folk driving out for a glimpse of something untamed, animal lovers who saw thunder as a symbol of everything beautiful and threatened about the West. Samuel tried to weather the attention, but the commotion left him uneasy. The homestead became a crossroads between two worlds, the old rhythms of ranch life and the new fascination with the wild. Scientists arrived, drawn by rumors of an unbreakable bond between a Mustang and a stubborn old man. They brought binoculars, clipboards, and gentle questions, marveling at Thunder's refusal to be domesticated, even as he lingered close to human company. Samuel didn't mind their curiosity, but he bristled at the idea that anyone could explain the horse's loyalty with charts or theories. Thunder's presence was something deeper, older, a silent agreement forged in the hardest nights of winter, built on the pain and patience they'd shared. Tensions rose when the local authorities began to take notice. Ranchers called the Bureau of Land Management, some out of genuine concern, others from old grudges or fear of change. Rumors twisted through the community. Some claimed Thunder was dangerous, a threat to livestock. Others saw him as a miracle, a living legend in the making. For Samuel, the truth was simpler and harder. The Mustang had become part of his daily life, a reminder of hope that still needed protecting from the world's interference. One afternoon, a group of schoolchildren arrived on a field trip, chattering excitedly as their teacher pointed out Thunder grazing on the distant plain. Their laughter echoed off the hills, cutting through the loneliness that had settled over the ranch. Samuel watched from the porch, arms folded, wondering what June would have thought of all this attention. She would have smiled, he decided, seeing in Thunder a promise that compassion and patience could still shape the world, even if only for a moment. The days grew longer, and the air began to soften with hints of coming spring. Yet the peace was uneasy, threatened by the currents swirling outside Samuel's control. Thunder's presence had become more than a personal struggle. It was now a flashpoint for debate about the fate of wild horses and the balance between tradition and change. Through it all, Samuel remained steadfast, caring for the land, protecting Thunder as best he could, and hoping that their fragile alliance would survive whatever storms the world might bring next. In those liminal weeks, caught between winter's end and the coming reckoning, Samuel realized that some boundaries could not be erased. Thunder was neither pet nor prisoner, neither wholly wild nor fully tamed. He belonged to the desert, to the memory of a woman who had taught Samuel the stubbornness of kindness, and to the uncertain hope that still glimmered, fragile as spring light, on the far edge of the Nevada sky. Spring advanced with its promise of renewal, but the sense of peace that had begun to take root around Samuel's homestead was short-lived. The increasing interest in Thunder's presence, fueled by stories, rumors, and the steady trickle of curious visitors, did not go unnoticed by those in power. It was only a matter of time before the state's wildlife authorities arrived, their white government SUVs kicking up dust along the road and scattering crows into the blue Nevada sky. The lead ranger, Wyatt Morse, was a man built for bureaucracy, clean boots, pressed uniform, and a clipboard always in hand. He arrived with 2 officers, all business, their faces set in polite but unyielding lines. Samuel watched them from the porch, arms crossed, Thunder's silhouette grazing in the distance. There was no anger in Samuel's eyes, only the calm resignation of a man who'd weathered too many storms to expect fairness from the world. The conversation was formal and brief. Morse explained that state law required all wild Mustangs to be documented, tagged, and relocated for the sake of both public safety and ecological balance. Thunder, in their view, was not just an individual animal. He was a potential problem, a disruption to the careful calculus of land and livestock that kept the region running. Samuel pleaded for understanding, explaining the horse's journey, his injuries, the long, painful recovery. But rules were rules, Morse reminded him, and sentimental stories couldn't rewrite regulations. Samuel's requests for more time fell on deaf ears. Morse offered a tight smile, promising that the removal would be humane and professional, and left a stack of paperwork on the kitchen table. Forms, notices, official letters stamped with the state's seal. The next visit, Morse warned, would not be a conversation. It would be an operation. They'd return with tranquilizer guns, trailers, and a team equipped to capture Thunder and transport him to a holding facility. Samuel stood in the empty doorway as the vehicles rolled away, the paperwork heavy in his hand, a knot of dread tightening in his chest. News of the coming removal spread quickly. The visitors who had once come to marvel at Thunder now came with concern, some with petitions, others with advice. Some urged Samuel to hide the Mustang deeper in the hills, to let him vanish before the authorities arrived. But Thunder was not a creature that could be hidden or controlled. He remained close to the homestead, almost as if he sensed the coming trouble, his presence both a comfort and a source of anguish. In the final days before the officials' return, Samuel barely slept. He spent hours watching Thunder roam the property, feeling a helplessness that cut deeper than any wound. He prepared extra feed, checked the fences, and paced the land, trying to will a solution into existence. Memories of June came to him in flashes, her certainty that compassion was worth every hardship, her quiet faith that good intentions could sometimes change fate. Samuel wondered now if she would have counseled him to let go, to trust the Mustang to his own destiny. When the day of reckoning came, the government team arrived early, their approach announced by the rumble of trucks and the distant flash of uniforms in the rising sun. Thunder stood at the edge of the field, his coat gleaming with health, legs still marked by scars, but strong and proud. He watched the strangers with a predator's wariness, every muscle coiled for flight. The Rangers fanned out, tranquilizer rifles at the ready. Samuel pleaded again for time, for mercy, but his words were drowned out by the noise and motion of the operation. As the first dart was loaded, Thunder's instincts took over. With a shrill, wild cry, he spun on his haunches and bolted, streaking across the open desert with astonishing speed. The officers shouted, stumbling over one another in their hurry to pursue, but Thunder vanished into the labyrinth of sage and stone, a fleeting shadow lost to the endless wild. In the aftermath, Samuel stood alone at the fence line, breathless with grief and guilt. The land felt emptier than it ever had, the silence heavy and accusing. For the first time since the storm, he felt truly old, stripped of hope, unable to protect what mattered most. Neighbors came by, some with kind words, others with warnings that more trouble was surely coming. But Samuel barely heard them. His eyes roamed the distant horizon, searching for a flash of chestnut or the wild toss of a black mane. Thunder was gone, but the bond they had forged in those long winter nights lingered, a silent ache in Samuel's chest. He could only wait and wonder if the world would ever bring the stallion back, or if, In choosing freedom over safety, thunder had given Samuel a final lesson in letting go. Winter in the Nevada high desert was a force that humbled even the most seasoned ranchers, and this year's storms seemed to carry a personal vendetta. The days after Thunder's disappearance bled together in a haze of chores and silence. Samuel moved through them in a kind of trance, his heart weighted by worry and regret. Every sound of the wind setting his nerves on edge. He checked the horizon each morning and evening, hoping for a glimpse of the Mustang, one flash of chestnut against the snow, one wild shape moving through the sage. But the land remained empty, as if thunder had become another myth swallowed by the desert. Samuel tried to convince himself that thunder was safer now, beyond the reach of tranquilizers and human laws. Still, the ache of absence pressed at him in the quiet moments, where memory and hope tangled together. He had always known that loving something wild meant letting it go, but the reality was harder than any lesson the land had ever taught him. With each passing day, the house felt colder, the nights longer, the world more hollowed out by loss. Then the blizzard struck, sudden and merciless. It descended on the valley with a violence that erased all thought of the past, all dreams of rescue or reunion. The wind howled like a wounded animal, scouring the ranch and driving snow sideways until fences disappeared and familiar trails vanished beneath drifts. Samuel woke that morning to a sky the color of lead, the windows rattling with each gust. He tried to tell himself he could ride it out, just another storm, but the cattle were restless, their plaintive calls rising above the wind. When he noticed one calf missing, a small, stubborn creature that often strayed, Samuel bundled himself in layers, pulled on his thickest boots, and set out into the storm with a halter, a lantern, and nothing but habit to guide him. He trudged through the whiteness, vision reduced to the circle of yellow cast by his lantern. Snow clawed at his face, melting down the back of his neck, and his breath came ragged with each step. The world beyond his light was an indistinct blur of white and gray, landmarks erased by the storm's fury. His heart hammered from the effort, and a warning ache crept through his chest, a reminder of his age, the old heart condition he'd stubbornly ignored for years. Samuel called for the calf, voice swallowed by the wind, moving from one snow-laden bush to the next, searching for the lost animal. He could barely see his own boots, much less any trace of tracks. Time lost meaning in that whiteout. Minutes stretched into hours, the landscape turning unfamiliar and hostile. He pressed on, body trembling, mind fixed on the image of June's gentle smile, her belief that life demanded kindness, even in the face of futility. The cold was absolute, creeping through his gloves and boots, turning fingers numb and slowing his steps. The pain in his chest sharpened, and Samuel staggered, clutching at his coat. He called out one last time, the sound more a plea than a command, then fell to his knees in the snow. The world spun and narrowed, the wind screaming overhead, the ground icy and unyielding beneath him. He thought of thunder then, not as a symbol, not as a legend, but as a living creature, fierce and fragile. In the blur between waking and collapse, Samuel wondered if the Mustang had survived, if some fragment of hope still flickered in the world. His breath slowed, his vision fading to black, and he surrendered to the cold, alone in the storm that showed no mercy for old men or lost dreams. But fate, that unpredictable master of the desert, was not yet finished. Out of the swirling white, a shadow took shape, a flash of movement, strong and sure. Thunder's scent cut through the blizzard, raw and wild, And then the horse himself emerged from the storm, chestnut coat streaked with snow, gold-flecked eyes burning with life. He circled Samuel, nostrils flaring, mane whipped by the wind, as if weighing the risk, the ancient fear, and the stubborn memory of trust. Thunder pressed his muzzle against Samuel's shoulder, prodding, insistent. When Samuel did not rise, the Mustang nudged him again, harder, using his head to push and pull. Somewhere in the fog of consciousness, Samuel felt the rough warmth of Thunder's breath, the raw strength behind each effort. The Mustang's hooves carved a path through the snow, circling until Samuel's body was half buried, then returning, refusing to leave. Minutes or hours blurred as Thunder persisted, driven by an instinct deeper than words or training. Each time Samuel's eyes fluttered open, he saw only the stallion, the storm, and the endless desert. It was Thunder who finally coaxed him to his feet, supporting Samuel's staggering, freezing body with gentle, unyielding pressure, guiding him step by uncertain step through the drifts. The journey back to the ranch was a delirium of pain, determination, and animal loyalty. Thunder leading, Samuel following, the wind at their backs. Hope rekindled against all odds. By the time they reached the shelter of the barn, Samuel was barely conscious, collapsing into the straw with the distant knowledge that he was alive only because the wild horse he had once saved had now returned the favor. The blizzard raged on outside, but in that moment, man and Mustang had weathered its worst. Together, bound by a trust neither could explain nor deny. Days slipped by in a haze as Samuel drifted between consciousness and the gray, slow-moving world of fever and exhaustion. The ordeal in the blizzard had stripped him of his strength. The cold had burrowed into his bones, and every breath was a reminder of how close he'd come to vanishing into the storm forever. He awoke to a blur of familiar faces. Dr. Marcus Bell, his longtime friend and local vet, moving briskly around the bedside, and Tom Buckley, hovering with awkward concern, filling the kitchen with the strong aroma of coffee and worry. Samuel's first clear memory was the flicker of lamplight on the ceiling, the sound of voices fading in and out, and the deep, almost sacred silence that filled the house when the others paused their bustling. In those quiet moments, he sensed, rather than saw, the presence of Thunder. The stallion lingered near the window, head high and eyes shining with something ancient and patient. No one tried to approach the Mustang, not after Tom described the way Thunder had stood watch through the night, refusing food and comfort, pacing restlessly until the worst of Samuel's fever had broken. It was Dr. Bell who first pieced together the story of Samuel's rescue. Tom had found Samuel collapsed just inside the barn, half buried in straw, with the great chestnut stallion standing over him like a sentinel. There were hoofprints in the snow, circling back and forth, as if Thunder had guided or even dragged Samuel to safety. Dr. Bell shook his head in disbelief, a seasoned man who thought he'd seen all that rural life had to offer. The newspapers had gotten their details wrong, he said. But the reality was even stranger. A wild horse, once saved by a stubborn rancher, now saving that rancher in return. Word spread fast. The story, already local legend, went viral. Journalists appeared, then TV crews, their vans and equipment turning the Parker homestead into an unlikely spectacle. Samuel, still weak, found himself at the center of a whirlwind. He didn't have the energy for interviews or speeches. He simply told the truth. He had done what he could for Thunder when no one else would, and the Mustang had repaid the debt in a way he could never have imagined. Crowds came, drawn by the promise of witnessing something miraculous. A wild Mustang, unbroken and untamed, yet unwilling to leave the side of the man who had rescued him. Thunder tolerated their presence with the aloof dignity of a creature who chose his own path. He allowed no halter or fence, keeping just enough distance to remain his own master, yet never wandering far. Scientists arrived with notebooks and cameras, trying to understand the phenomenon. They spoke in hushed tones of imprinting, survival instincts, and rare bonds that could form between human and beast, but no explanation seemed sufficient. Despite the commotion, life on the ranch found a new, uneasy rhythm. Tom helped with chores, and Dr. Bell checked Samuel's heart and lungs, scolding him gently but with real affection. Neighbors brought food and firewood, curious and admiring, though some still muttered about the dangers of wild animals so close to civilization. Samuel endured their attention with the stoicism of a man who had outlived his need for approval, focusing instead on small tasks, patching fences, mending tack, moving slowly but stubbornly through each day. Through it all, Thunder remained a presence at the edge of every moment. Sometimes Samuel would see the stallion at dawn, standing on a rise, watching the ranch as if claiming it as his own territory. Other times, Thunder would appear beside the barn at dusk, accepting a handful of oats with regal indifference before slipping away into the sage. Their bond, forged in the crucible of winter, needed no words or gestures. It was simply there, a quiet assurance that neither was truly alone. The growing public pressure forced the government to reconsider its stance. The Bureau of Land Management, flooded with petitions and questions from around the country, hesitated. Their plans to relocate Thunder were quietly shelved, replaced by vague promises of ongoing observation and community engagement. Samuel knew bureaucracy could shift with the wind, but for now, Thunder was safe, and that was enough. As winter loosened its grip and the first hints of spring green appeared in the gullies, Samuel felt a lightness he hadn't known in years. The ordeal of the storm, the threat of loss, and the pain of old wounds, physical and otherwise, had not disappeared. But they no longer defined his days. Instead, he found meaning in the shared routines, in the sound of Thunder's hooves crunching frost at dawn, in the laughter of children who came to see the legendary Mustang, and in the quiet certainty that the world, for all its cruelty, could still surprise him with kindness. The bond between Samuel and Thunder, unbreakable and unexplainable, had transformed both their lives, and in the eyes of the world, what began as a desperate rescue had become something more, a living reminder of trust, of loyalty, and of the wild hope that lingers even at the edge of despair. As the thaw of spring rolled slowly across the high desert, the ranch seemed to breathe easier. Patches of green began to break through the faded winter grass, and the air lost its icy edge. Samuel, still regaining his strength, spent long afternoons sitting on the porch, watching Thunder graze at the far edge of the property. There was a sense of peace, but also the quiet tension that comes from knowing peace is only ever borrowed, never owned. The story of Samuel and Thunder had, by now, spread far beyond Nevada. Letters arrived from people he'd never met, children sending drawings of wild horses, ranchers from distant states sharing stories of lost animals and stubborn hope, city dwellers confessing how the Mustang's tail had moved them. Samuel was grateful for the kindness, but he read each letter with the measured reserve of a man who had lived long enough to know that all stories, no matter how miraculous, eventually become old news. What mattered was the day-to-day living, the creak of the gate at sunrise, the rough texture of Thunder's mane as he brushed past, the shared solitude that spoke louder than any words. The government, prodded by a swell of public sympathy and the embarrassment of national attention, finally offered a solution. Representatives from the Bureau of Land Management arrived, this time less as enforcers and more as diplomats, suits and boots dusted by the Nevada wind. They explained their decision. Thunder would be granted a special exemption, a rare free partner status. He would not be caged, tagged, or shipped off to a distant holding facility. As long as he remained on Samuel's land, and as long as he was not confined or treated as livestock, he could stay. The ranch, in effect, would become a haven, one of the few places where a wild Mustang and a solitary rancher might live on their own terms. Samuel listened to the proposal in silence, heart swelling with a complicated mix of relief and sorrow. He recognized the gift, but also the reality that nothing lasts forever. Not government promises, not public attention, not even the fragile trust between man and beast. He signed the papers with a steady hand, feeling June's spirit at his shoulder, her gentle wisdom guiding him through the moment. The exemption brought a brief celebration. Neighbors stopped by with casseroles and congratulations. Local children cheered, and even Tom Buckley, never one for sentiment, clapped Samuel on the back with a rare smile. For a few days, the ranch felt almost festive, a crossroads where old grudges were put aside, and hope seemed to take root in the Nevada soil. But Samuel sensed the change in Thunder as well. The Mustang's restlessness returned, subtle at first. Longer absences, midnight forays into the distant foothills, a new wariness in his gaze. He no longer lingered by the barn or accepted oats from Samuel's hand. Instead, he watched from the ridgeline, a shadow caught between two worlds, drawn to the safety of the ranch, but pulled by the ancient call of the wild. One evening, as a warm wind swept across the plain and dusk bled slowly into night, Samuel opened the gates at the far end of his property. He did it quietly, without ceremony or audience, his only companions the memory of June and the hush of settling darkness. The decision was both simple and profound. Thunder would never again be confined, not by fences or laws or human need. Whatever had grown between them was built on choice, not possession. Thunder appeared on the ridge as if summoned, his silhouette sharp against the indigo sky. For a long moment, he remained still, the wind ruffling his mane, his eyes reflecting the last light of day. Then, with a snort and a toss of his head, he trotted down to the open gate. Samuel stood by, hands in his pockets, heart pounding, not with loss, but with a fierce, aching pride. Thunder paused beside him, nostrils flaring, and for an instant their eyes met. It was not a farewell, not really, but a mutual recognition. Both had given, both had gained, both had been changed. The stallion moved on, slipping through the open gate and vanishing into the sea of sage and shadow. Samuel watched until darkness swallowed him, the world settling into a profound silence that felt more like gratitude than grief. He did not weep or call after Thunder. Instead, he sat on the porch and let the night embrace him, comforted by the knowledge that true loyalty is measured not by how tightly you hold on, but by how freely you let go. In the days that followed, the ranch seemed emptier, but also lighter. The fences no longer felt like barriers, but like gentle boundaries, lines drawn not to confine, but to protect. Samuel worked the land, welcomed visitors, and told the story when asked, always finishing with the same lesson, that in giving Thunder his freedom, he had found a greater measure of his own. And as the first wildflowers appeared in the gullies, Samuel understood what June had always tried to teach him, that love, at its purest, is an open gate. Seasons passed, the relentless march of time painting new patterns across the Nevada high desert. Summer bled into fall, then yielded to another winter, each cycle leaving its marks on the land and on Samuel himself. Yet the ranch never returned to its old, lonely quiet. Instead, echoes of the legend that had grown around Samuel Parker and Thunder seemed to linger in the dust and the wind, as if the story had woven itself into the bones of the place. Thunder was not gone, not entirely. He became a living myth in the valley, appearing and disappearing with a freedom that no law or fence could diminish. Sometimes, at dawn, Samuel would glimpse the chestnut stallion in the distance, mane wild and black as midnight, eyes burning with gold flecks as he surveyed the ranch from the ridgeline. Other times, Thunder would return for a day or two, wandering the fields as if checking that all was as it should be, then vanishing again into the wide-open country, leaving only hoofprints and the faint, bittersweet scent of sage in his wake. Each visit was different. Sometimes Thunder would linger at the water trough. Sometimes he'd let Samuel approach and offer a gentle word or the brush of a calloused hand down his neck. More often, he kept his distance, content to share the same sky and sunlight, needing nothing more than the knowledge that the gate would always be open. The rhythm of his comings and goings became as much a part of ranch life as sunrise and sunset, shaping Samuel's days with hope and a kind of peace. The story, however, refused to fade. It had outgrown Samuel's modest porch and the boundaries of Willow Creek. Children who once drew crayon Mustangs sent letters from far-off cities. Writers and filmmakers arrived, eager to capture the magic that lived between man and horse. University students came for research, biologists hoping to understand the wild loyalty Thunder had shown, psychologists intrigued by the healing that had taken root in Samuel's life. Reporters camped along the fence line, their cameras searching for the legendary stallion, their questions trailing after Samuel wherever he went. Yet fame changed little of substance. Samuel remained the same, a quiet, reserved man who worked the land as he always had, tending cattle, mending fences, and living with a humility born of loss and endurance. The crowds came and went, but Samuel's focus stayed true. He found himself, surprisingly, sharing his story not just for the sake of entertainment, but to remind others of what wildness and trust could mean. He spoke to children about the difference between taming and respecting, about how real loyalty was earned, not imposed. He told scientists that sometimes what cannot be measured is the most powerful force of all. Gradually, the ranch took on new life. Samuel opened his gates to those who wanted to learn, school children on field trips, conservationists studying wild herds, families drawn by the promise of hope. Under the broad Nevada sky, they listened to the tale of the storm, the rescue, the long winter, and the open gate. Many left changed, hearts touched by the stubborn resilience of two lost souls who had chosen, again and again, to trust. Thunder's legend spread beyond the desert. His story sparked debates about the treatment of wild horses, inspired local efforts to protect free-roaming herds, and reminded people everywhere that the line between wild and tame is thinner than they imagine. Animal welfare organizations cited Thunder as proof of the need for compassion and patience, while writers and artists turned his likeness into poems, paintings, and dreams. For Samuel, the bond remained personal, a thread tying him not only to Thunder, but to June, to the life they had built, and to the world beyond the ranch. He walked the land with new purpose, greeting each sunrise as a gift, each visit from thunder as a quiet miracle. Loss no longer haunted him as it once had. In its place grew gratitude, rooted in memory and watered by every new beginning. The legend of Samuel and Thunder became a touchstone for the community. Locals stopped by the porch, not just for news of the Mustang, but for the comfort of Samuel's presence and the wisdom in his steady gaze. He counseled patience to the impatient, offered hope to the weary, and listened more than he spoke. In time, he realized the greatest lesson Thunder had given him was not about survival, but about letting go and opening one's heart to what might come next. Years rolled onward, marked by wildflower blooms and the return of migrating birds, by the distant thunder of hooves in the night and the gentle laughter of children. Thunder's visits became less frequent as he ranged farther across the high desert, but his spirit remained, a living promise that freedom and trust could coexist, that compassion could shape even the hardest ground. And so the story endured, passed from parent to child, from neighbor to newcomer. People came to the ranch for many reasons, but all left with the same feeling, that in the vast, wild places of the world, and in the hearts of those who refuse to give up, there is always room for wonder, for hope, and for the kind of connection that can outlast any storm. Samuel, once lonely and resigned, had found not just a companion, but a calling, a reason to keep his gates open and his spirit unbroken, carrying forward the lesson that the wild, like love itself, is meant to be free.